Thank you very much, Andrew, and I'm delighted to be back here at the Council of Economic Science. As Andrew said, I think I spoke here about 5 years ago at one of the launch presentations of my previous book. And what I'm going to talk about today does reflect the thinking and research that I undertook for that project, but it also reflects thinking and research that we've been doing at NEF over the last 2 or 3 years as well on land. And I'm essentially going to try and do the same sort of trick that we manage with Where Does Money Come From in trying to put out a sort of popular stroke textbook that is widely is accessible to the general public as well as to students, but at the same time pushes back gently but firmly against mainstream thinking around the role of economics, the role of land in the economy. And for that reason it's called Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing. And of course, housing is an extremely topical issue in this country right now. And I'm going to particularly focus some of my comments today on how the relationship between land and money and credit, with banks being the primary creator of money, has shaped the housing crisis that we face today. I'm going to try and do 5 things actually. That's probably a bit ambitious for an hour, but I'll start off by explaining how money and land were understood by classical economists, classical political economists, and then how at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that understanding was lost as neoclassical mainstream general equilibrium economics came to the fore. So there's going to be a bit of intellectual history, which I think is really, really important in understanding how on earth we ended up in the situation we're in today. And then I'm going to try and explain the policy implications of that neglect and that misunderstanding, which is of course where working at a think tank, that's what we've been trying to do for the last 4 or 5 years. And then I'll spend a bit of time talking about potential alternative policies that might help us get out of this mess that we're in. And finally, if I have some time, maybe some suggestions for the kinds of areas we need to be exploring in more depth. I'd like to just make clear that some of the ideas I'm going to be talking about are quite complicated, and part of the thing I've been trying to do throughout the last 7 years working at NEF is just make these ideas more accessible. And I'm hoping this audience is reasonably well educated already for the most part, and I do hope in your questions and answers in the question and answer session, if there's anything that's unclear, please let me know, because that's really what I'm trying to do here is communicate these things in a way that mainstream, I think journalists and the mainstream media and politicians have failed to do actually. So that's very important to me. So I'll start with money. What is money? Well, it's usually defined in terms of its functions, and those are normally thought of as 3. It's a store of value, it's a way of holding value in a form that makes it accessible, enables you to access it when needed. It's a unit of account, it's a way of enabling us to measure value, and that of course enables us to use it as a medium of exchange, to trade goods and services. Those are the 3 classical functions. Means of settlement is a related function as well. But whilst that was perhaps understood by some of the early economists, mainstream or neoclassical theory emphasised very much the medium of exchange function of money over the other forms, and envisaged the nature of money essentially to be as a commodity, like any other commodity, something that could be exchanged in the marketplace for other goods and services. But the essential difference with money as a commodity is it had special properties that meant it was very useful in representing other goods and services. So it was highly durable, it was divisible, you could divide it up and use it. It was relatively, the commodity itself should be homogeneous, It's clear what it is. It's gold, it's silver, it can't be turned into anything else. And the idea was that those types of commodities could be used to avoid the problems of barter, essentially. That rather than having to find my 20 chickens to trade for your 1 cow, I could simply have enough gold or units, tokens, representative of that number of chickens to trade for your cow. And this would essentially optimize and enhance market exchange. So we have this notion of the barter myth, and Adam Smith talked about this. And here actually classical political economists, I think, failed in a sense to properly understand the nature of money. But anyway, this led to a conception of money as a commodity, and as essentially its most important function by far was this medium of exchange. So I just want to quote the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter on this, because I think he, almost better than anyone else, identified where this understanding of money would lead us. It would lead us to a notion of money as essentially a neutral veil, really, over the real economy. And he said, real analysis proceeds from the principle that all essential phenomena of economic life are capable of being described in terms of goods and services, of decisions about them and relations between them. Money enters the picture only in the modest role of a technical device that has been adopted in order to facilitate transactions. So long as it functions normally, it does not affect the economic process, which behaves in the same way as it would in a barter economy. This is essentially what the concept of neutral money implies. So this mainstream notion of money as a commodity makes a clear separation between the real economy, where sort of real people are exchanging cows and chickens and all the other things we need to exchange, and then this sort of monetary economy, which is just a sort of veil symbolizing these real exchanges. And the ideas that emerged in mainstream economics is that exchange would be driven on the basis of people's marginal utility, that is, the balance between the convenience obtained from holding this or that good and the risk avoided from holding those goods. And it was a very mathematically elegant sort of model, and it became very popular. And it led to a model of economy that looked something like this sort of circular flow, where essentially we have on one side workers who consume products and services, and firms that use that money that's been spent to invest in production and produce goods and services, paying those workers who then consume those goods and services, and round we go. Essentially, this is the classic circular flow model of the economy, and then we can add the government on top of that, and the role of the government is essentially to provide some key services like defence, or maybe building roads, or other things that the market struggles with. But there wasn't too much attention paid to that, and it was generally felt that whilst you did need a bit of taxation and public spending, the key bit is the market in the middle, the relations between firms and consumers. Now, you might wonder in this model how exactly money fits into it. And as I've sort of said, the bottom line is it doesn't really need to, because the core is this exchange of goods and services. But economists did recognise that money did exist, and they had to sort of fit it into the model. And the model that sort of became widely accepted was this one, really, that banks essentially would take the savings of workers where they couldn't immediately spend them on goods and services, and recycle them to firms that needed those savings for investment. So it's a bank as intermediary model, which kind of makes sense in this schema, in the sense that we're just sort of adding banks really in between workers and production, and we're sort of increasing the efficiency of the market in doing so, really. And that's the very crudely put, that is the circular flow model and the role of banks that actually, until relatively recently, was quite dominant in certainly in a sort of undergraduate economics textbooks, macroeconomics, with lots of detailed study of the behaviour of workers and firms under different conditions and how their marginal utility would determine the exchange of goods and services. Now, this model of the economy is essentially wrong, and it's really never really applied. And the barter myth, in fact, is just that, it's a myth. And if you read any of David Graeber's work, or Michael Hudson's work, or any archaeologist of money or historian of money, you will see just how much of a myth it really is. In reality, there is very little evidence of any kind of barter economies ever existing. People have always used credits and units to exchange goods and services right from Babylonian times. There's evidence of this, in fact, well before the existence of markets as we know them today. The truth is that money in economies is not a commodity primarily, it's a social relationship, and it's a relationship of credit and debt. And that's why banks and money are not neutral, because no social relationship, you think of a social relationship that you would describe as neutral, they never are. They're always relationships where one party typically has a different set of circumstances than another. And you may, sort of looking at this chart, you may wonder, actually, isn't there some issues with this conception of the economy? Because, I mean, where does the money come from, actually, to begin the circular flow? It's sort of, it's not very clear, you know, do the workers create it? Do the firms create it? I mean, these commodities, do they just appear and then some of them get turned into money? None of this is explained, essentially, in economics textbooks. It's always an imagine a world where people were bartering, and then imagine a good that becomes more money-like. There's no empirical evidence for it. The truth is that, and some of you by the sounds of it probably know this stuff already, but modern money works a bit like this. This is a bank balance sheet, a simplified bank balance sheet. On one side you have the bank's assets, consumer loans, some lending between banks, and assets that banks hold. And then you just have a small amount of, down here you have a very small amount of cash that you can withdraw when you choose to turn some of your electronic bank deposits into something liquid that you can spend, and central bank reserves. And on the other side you have bank deposits. And of course the act of creating new money simply involves an increase in this deposit at the same time as a loan is made in this format. On the one side, you sign a loan with the bank has a new asset, its assets increase, it expands its balance sheet, a new loan agreement is created, and in step 2, the bank credits your account, creating a new deposit. And that deposit, that IOU from the bank, is money. And no one else's money has been taken from anywhere else in the economy to create that asset. So it's an expansion on both sides of the bank's balance sheet. And this point, sadly, was simply not understood by many of the neoclassical economists as they developed these general equilibrium, real analyses of the economy. And there's our friend Joseph Schumpeter again. Without the creation of new purchasing power by bank credits, the financing of industrial development would not have been possible. And Keynes as well, talking about how rather than savings, existing savings, which have come from nowhere, fund investment, it is credit expansion that creates savings. It is the preparation that creates the saving. So that money, credit, is the parent, not the twin of increased saving. And that gives us a different perspective on our circular flow. Suddenly, we have banks and credit that actually initiate production when they expand their balance sheet. This is how it's possible for money to enter the economy. This is how it's possible for a firm that has no savings to access purchasing power, because you you may have found it's difficult to just go to a big company like Apple and just say, look, I've got a great idea, will you give me some money? Generally it doesn't happen. Generally they have to go to banks to get that startup funding. And banks play this key role of providing credit to firms, and they also, as I'll talk about, provide credit to workers for consumption. The result of that is that we need to understand the economy as a place where both credit is provided by banks and debt is accrued by firms and households. And of course, this debt servicing plays a very important role, because we must pay interest on that debt. And those flows of interest have real effects. They really affect how much firms will invest in the economy. They will really affect how much we consume. Once our debt levels reach a certain level, it will affect our spending. And this is what economists missed. They assumed that because the role of money was neutral, because the amount of credit would always equal the amount of debt overall, then this huge build-up of debt that we saw in the lead-up to the crisis could be safely neglected. So that is money, and I've tried to sort of do that as quickly as possible, because I want to talk about land as well. And what about land? Well, the story of land is interestingly different from the money story. Because this is a story where actually the classical economists, like Adam Smith and Mill and Ricardo, actually got it right. They understood that land was not neutral and was absolutely fundamental to the economic process and the production process, because, as some of you may know, they hypothesized the economy as one with three key factors of production: land, capital and labour, and each one was viewed as having distinctive properties. And what this of course meant, and this is what they recognised, is that because land was fixed in contrast to capital and labour and naturally scarce and irreproducible, all else being equal, any increase in the demand for that factor would tend to lead to an increase in its price rather than an increase in its supply or quantity. And this recognition led the classical political economists to advocate for taxation to be placed primarily onto land, because it was clear to them that those individuals or firms or households that happen to own this scarce factor of production would gain from increases in the price of land as the economy itself develops, because of its natural scarcity. Economic rent being the term that these scholars use. And of course, I know this school has invested many years in trying to teach this kind of notion, and particularly the work of Henry George, who, as Andrew was saying, really developed the concept of economic rent and the idea of the land value tax for a later period in the 19th century. And so essentially you should give some credit to the classical political economists here in a way that you might not want to in regard to their understanding of money. But what happened was, towards the end of the 19th century, in the turn of the 20th century, as neoclassical economics emerged, these insights were lost, and it was partially a sort of academic sort of fight, but actually real developments in the world also led to this happening, I think, because when the classical economists were writing, agriculture, land was still used very clearly for the production of food, and the economic value of land was very visible to everybody. If you owned some fields and you could grow stuff on it, you could clearly make a lot of money. And Ricardo was very concerned about the monopolistic profits he felt landowners were making. And but when we had the Industrial Revolution, this became slightly less visible, because increasingly land was being used for industrial production, and the onset of the railway seemed to open up land, as it were. It was less clear what its value was. But anyway, the neoclassical economists developed a concept of capital which essentially spread itself across the three factors of production. And this is all very kind of mysterious, this concept. John Bates Clark was, who is still heralded as a great economist, and given, you know, in the US you get a John Bates Clark medal if you're a great economist. But he developed this concept of a fund of pure capital that is homogeneous across land, labour and capital goods. And this was all part of the attempt by neoclassical scholars to identify universal or natural rules that could be applied across economics and enhance its status as an objective science. The idea is that scientific rules, and try and get the sort of politics out of it, really, because there was a great effort with the Enlightenment to develop a more scientific notion of economic rules. It's kind of hard to explain this, but I'll just read you a little quote here from Philip Wicksteed, a famous English economist, talking about land and how it is interchangeable with other factors of production. This was in 1914. And he says, land, manifold apparatus, various specialised faculties of the hand, eye and brain are essential, let us say, to the production of some commodity valued by someone for some purpose. None of these heterogeneous factors, so he's admitting that they are different, can be dispensed with, and therefore their product and its totality is dependent upon the cooperation of each one severally. But there is room for a wide variety in the proportions in which they are combined, and whatever the existing proportion, maybe each factor has a differential significance, and all these differential significances can be expressed in a common unit. That is to say, all can be expressed in terms of each other, by noting the increment or decrement of any one that would be the equivalent of a given decrement or increment of any other. Equivalence being measured by the neutralizing of the effect upon the product, or rather not upon the material product itself, but the command of generalized resources in the circle of exchange for the sake of which it is produced. Well, this is extremely poorly written, difficult to understand, but I just chose that because actually John Bates Clark work is even more obtuse and difficult to understand. And my conclusion from reading this stuff in the writing of the book is that actually this was a specific approach taken by these economists, so that they weren't actually questioned because nobody could understand what they were talking about. But you can tell from the final sentence there that it is an attempt to return us away from a notion that there may be a non-neutrality to money and other factors of production like land, towards this idea that everything can be understood as part of this circular flow and circular exchange. It is, all things can be reduced to essentially the marginal utility or marginal productivity of a good and service vis-a-vis another good or service in the economy. And all kinds of exchange, ultimately in the long run, and they admitted, these economists, of some short-run rigidities, that, you know, in the short run some factors of production might be fixed that can hold up the flow, but in the long run it's assumed that all of these factors, including land, are equally variable, and thus can be understood by the same set of rules. And in microeconomic theory you will find utility demand functions for land, labour and capital, that in the long run the shape of the curve is the same, essentially. Now, of course, this conflation of land and capital, or this sort of expansion of capital to absorb every other factor of production, is a very, very problematic concept, because land and capital are not the same. They are fundamentally different, and I'll just go through some of those key differences. Land is permanent and it is fixed. It does not depreciate. Actually, as you've probably noticed, if you have a property anywhere within the sort of 30 or 40 mile radius of central London, it appreciates as the economy grows. In contrast, capital is impermanent and it depreciates. Machinery, your computer, your mobile phone, and even very well-made products, tables, they lose value over time. both because of natural obsolescence and because of competition advances in technology. So that's a fundamental difference. The demand and competition for land increases as the economy develops, as phones and other forms of technology and food become relatively cheaper, as we find ways of mass producing them and increasing the efficiency of their production. More of our income will actually tend towards those things that cannot be, the value of which cannot be made cheaper by technological development. The key one being locationally desirable land. We all want to have the little bit of land next to the decent school for our kids, and we will sacrifice many other things in order to get that bit of land near the good school. And so actually the value of land increases vis-a-vis the general economic growth in the economy, and you can see that looking at Thomas Piketty's work. This chart shows property wealth as a percentage of GDP since 1700 in Britain, France and the US, and you can see particularly since in the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century, very rapid increases in property wealth relative to GDP as more and more as the economy grows, but the amount of land, particularly locationally desirable land, just stays the same. Its price is inevitably full stop, and I'll talk a bit more about wealth, the relationship between wealth and land shortly. Three final points about the differences between land and capital. Land is a zero-sum asset. It can only be used for one thing at a time. If it's being used for one thing, even if it's being left, a plot of land being left vacant, it means some other activity cannot happen in that plot of land. So it is a zero-sum game. Capital, on the other hand, it increases in investment, increases in the quality of goods and technology and services, can increase aggregate demand, aggregate growth in the economy. Nobody is losing when technology improves. That's another big difference. Land is immobile, you can't move it around unless we maybe colonize Mars perhaps. Capital is highly mobile, as we have seen. This is what Brexit's all about, is whether capital will flow away from this country to other countries. Rising land values eat into the costs of production. If a firm if the rent the firm is paying increases, it must cut down on investment. Again, a zero-sum kind of thinking, an opportunity cost. But when the return on capital investment increases, it actually draws in more investment. More people will put their money into that service or industry as returns rise, pushing up interest rates till some sort of equilibrium is arrived upon. So, to conflate land and capital is fundamentally problematic, and this is one of the great mistakes, really, or that neoclassical economics has made. Now, what are the consequences of this neglect of money, or misunderstanding of money and land, and what is their interaction? That's what I'm going to talk about now. Well, the effects are profound. Essentially, we've had a situation where economists and policymakers have focused the two great tools of macroeconomic policy, that's monetary policy and fiscal policy, taxation and spending by the government, on the wrong thing, because they have neglected the role of money and land. So their focus has been on trying to remove any intervention that prevents the smooth functioning of the exchange of goods and services, this circular flow that I've tried to explain. The smooth operation of markets, removing rigidities, regulations, trade unions, taxes that hold back market exchange, and the allowing individuals to fully express their marginal utility in pricing, preventing the market from clearing. And actually, it was really from the 1970s that this conception of the economy was really adopted by policymakers. Banks and finance was freed up from the regulations and attempts to sort of constrain the flow of credit and money creation that we had in the immediate post-war period, because the Second World War led to a great sort of collectivization of different sectors in fighting the war and then in building the welfare state in this country and many other countries. And finance was, had to play its role. Banks had to play their role in supporting the real economy. In a sense, finance was made to be the servant of a growing economy. But in the 1970s, as neoclassical theory became dominant, this changed. And the banking system, the financial sector was deregulated, and money was freed to go to where banks felt it should best go, and because these banks are commercial operations for the most part, to where it would create the most profit. And the key thing, the key juncture, the late 60s, well actually the early 70s, was that banks, the regulations and constraints on mortgage debt, mortgage lending, in other words, bank lending against land, were removed in this country and in the United States and other countries. Previous to this, only certain types of financial institution, building societies in this country and savings and loans companies in the US were actually really, banks could lend, but they had to hold too much liquidity against mortgage loans for it to be worth their while. So building societies, which had very conservative lending habits, were the only kinds of financial institution that could lend against land. But this all changed in the 1970s. At the same time, in the 1960s in this country, a number of important fiscal policy steps were taken that essentially ignored the thinking of Henry George and the other classical political economists that the burden of taxation should fall upon land. And this was partially due to the creation of many homes in the post-war, the earlier part of the 20th century, in the post-war period, and this idea actually that we should all, as a right, to have a home. Home ownership became politically extremely popular. It was seen as a right rather than a privilege, not just the privilege of the middle classes. And governments turned towards the taxation system, as well as other subsidies, to encourage home ownership. The list of these removals, deregulation of tax on homes is as follows. 1963, the government removed the tax on imputed rent. So previously we had a tax on the amount of rent you would be saving if you were lucky enough to own a home. That was removed in 1963. 1965, capital gains tax was introduced, but primary residences were completely excluded. So capital gains was essentially fell on shares and financial assets, not on land assets. The National Audit Office estimated the value of these two tax exemptions in 2014 to be 18.7 billion. 1967, we used to have a separate land value tax that was abolished, and it was incorporated into council tax, stamp duty and business rates. These are property taxes. They tax both the land and the property upon which the buildings sit. And so they're less efficient in that sense, because they're taxing both the physical property, which you can see as capital, where you can make improvements, but they're also taxing the land that's underneath them, which rises through no virtue, through no investment of you as an individual, but from the collective investment in the economy. So it's a less efficient tax. And of course, many of you may know, council tax has not actually been revised since 1991. So all of the gains in land values since then have not been captured through taxation. 1969, mortgage interest relief at source was abolished. This was phased out in 2000, but still applied to buy-to-let mortgages. And George Osborne, one of the few good things he's done is actually removed quite a lot of that recently. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that suddenly owning a home not only became sort of socially and culturally seen as highly desirable, but actually economically it became much more desirable. And at the same time, we had this deregulation of mortgage credit. What was the result of this? Well, it was a spectacular growth of mortgage credit vis-à-vis other forms of credit. And you can see here, the blue line shows domestic mortgage credit, domestic mortgage loans outstanding, and the red line shows lending to the real economy, to non-financial corporations, to businesses. And you can see in the 70s this sudden split between the two aggregates. This is relative to GDP, just to scale things. And you can see early 80s it's around 20% of GDP lending against land, domestic mortgages, rising up to over 70% in the run-up to the financial crisis. Meanwhile, lending to firms, the lending that actually drives the real economy, barely gets above 25%. Why is this important? Just getting some slides mixed up here. Well, there's two different circuits of bank credit. The first circuit is when a bank makes a loan to a business. The bank makes the loan, we call this productive credit if you like. The firm increases its investment, and this leads to more jobs, increased GDP transactions, hopefully an increase in productivity and higher wages. This in itself leads to increased consumption. This leads to increased demand for goods and services. This leads to businesses wishing to expand, asking for more productive investment from the credit-creating, money-creating banking system. And that is how economies can grow. And under that system, the debt that is created is sustainable. Because the economy is growing, it is possible for businesses to both pay the interest, as long as it's not too high, and the principal without creating financial instability. So that's the first circuit. And in a sense, you can think of this great, that up to the sort of 1970s period, in many countries, this was the dominant circuit or certainly in the sort of 1945 to 1970 period, this was the dominant circuit of money and bank credit. But then we have the second circuit, and this is where banks predominantly are lending against not to firms for investment, not productive credit, but lending against existing assets, and in particular against land, against real estate. And this circuit has a completely different set of dynamics. What you get when credit is lent against land, because land is finite, is an increase in land prices. And of course that increase in land prices feeds into the demand for mortgage credit, because as land values and house prices rise, so people need more mortgage credit to afford to buy property. So it's self-reinforcing. The other dynamic is of course an increasing burden of debt, because the money is not creating jobs, it's not improving productivity, it's not being put into new technology or advances in technology, it is simply inflating asset prices. And so the debt is much less sustainable. And we can of course have very long 30-year mortgages, which are becoming more and more common, and we can have permanently low interest rates, as we have today. But ultimately, the ratio of debt to people's income continues to increase, and this weighs down upon the economy. It weighs down, it has real effects, the monetary economy having real effects on consumption, on aggregate demand in the economy, and wages without that investment by firms will stagnate, and there will be reduced demand for productive credit to the other circuit, and increased demand for household debt, as I said, as land values increase in this circle. So this deregulation that happened, and the removal of taxation on land that led to their increase, is putting us in this dangerous place. And just to show you the distribution of bank credit in the UK, as opposed to just its ratio to GDP, what you can see here is the blue line, the blue blocks here are mortgage credit, domestic real estate, and the red is commercial real estate. So it's not just domestic mortgages, also big increases in lending for commercial property, increasing from less than 30% of total lending in '86 to almost 50. This is just UK domestic banks, not foreign banks, by 2014. And the other categories there, and then this huge shrinkage in lending to non-financial firms, real investment, from around 40% of GDP, almost 50% of the total in '86, to just 10% today. Now, it's not just in Britain that this phenomenon occurred. This is some research by a couple of economists based in the US, wrote a very good paper called The Great Mortgaging, and it shows that in the last 40 years, 30 years, mortgage lending, this is across 17 advanced economies, mortgage lending has overtaken non-mortgage lending to firms as a ratio to GDP. Banks essentially are not what we are told they are in the textbooks. They are turning into real estate lenders and speculators rather than lending to firms. Now, this has important consequences, and they're not all negative, because by deregulating the lending of banks against land for property, and by inflating house prices, these assets that we all own, we feel wealthier. Okay? Now, if we feel wealthier, it's likely we will spend more, particularly if we think that wealth is going to increase in the future. So, to some extent, although there's falling investment into the real economy, into production, this can be sort of tempered to some extent by increases in consumption. And of course, the deregulation that happened in the 80s in particular also allowed us for the first time to borrow against the value of these rising assets of our house prices through mortgage equity withdrawal. And of course, this was absolutely key, in fact, to the episodes of growth that the UK experienced, both under Thatcher and under Tony Blair. And this chart just shows you the growth of mortgage equity withdrawal, and you can see that big rise in home equity withdrawal in the 80s Lawson boom, followed by a very rapid collapse of the housing bubble of the late 80s, and then again during Blair's golden period in the run-up to the financial crisis, we again had, and Brown's, we again had a big growth in mortgage equity withdrawal, the percentage of GDP on the right-hand scale and the amount in billions on the left-hand scale there. So essentially, rather than our economy generating growth from investment in production, goods and services, we are gaining growth in a much less sustainable manner through increases in house prices and land that we leverage up against via a liberalised banking system. Now, ultimately, this leads us to a very dangerous situation, what I've called a sort of modern day doom loop of the relationship between the banking system and land and house prices, essentially. And unfortunately, for the reasons I've just explained, because we become dependent on high house prices to keep consumption going as real wages stagnate, as production relative to other forms of investment decreases, the government has got very cold feet about doing anything about preventing or at least stabilising house prices. And the central bank, the same kind of argument I think can be made. So I don't know if you guys can read that at the back, but essentially this just shows this sort of mess, this mess that we're in. The liberalisation of the banking sector, the deregulation of the banking sector leads to an increase in the supply of mortgage credit. This leads to an increase in mortgage debt relative to incomes, and as it said, stagnating wages. We also have the attack on the welfare state, of course, which made the home a much more attractive form of long-term security. Our house or our buy-to-let property can sort out our pension as that declines in value. This leads to an increase in land and house prices relative to income. essentially land becomes a speculative asset rather than a place to house ourselves or to house production. Increased demand for mortgage debt, increased pressure to deregulate the banking sector, and on it goes. And of course it's not sustainable because, as I said, ultimately the amount of debt in the economy will weigh down upon the real economy. The monetary and the real economy are intimately connected. The long-term consequence of this dynamic, of course, helps us to understand this general fall in productivity gains and the secular stagnation that Lawrence Summers has been talking about. Because an increasing quantity of purchasing power of new money created by the banking system is flowing into non-productive existing assets, in particular into land. And this is for me the key phenomena that is driving the macroeconomies of most advanced economies today, with some exceptions which I'll talk about. And this is another chart from Piketty that essentially illustrates this problem. This shows the wealth to income ratio in the United Kingdom, and if you include the blue block, then you include capital gains, partially from financial assets, but mainly from land, real estate assets. And you can see a steady growth in the wealth to income ratio. But if you exclude those capital gains, if you exclude that economic rent, essentially a lot of this is monopolistic gain simply from owning a finite, scarce resource, land, you can see that wealth to income ratio is actually falling. Now that has very important consequences. It essentially means that the so-called increase in savings is sort of puzzle us as to how there seems to be more wealth but falling wages and falling productivity. Well, this chart explains that problem. The majority of that increase in wealth and so-called savings is not flowing into productive activity, it's not flowing into GDP growth, it's not creating jobs, and it is the key cause of the problems that we are having in our economy. This also has very important distributional impacts, because most of the new credit created by the banking system that is flowing into land and house prices goes to those already owning those assets. That's a fairly obvious point. And of course those people tend to be concentrated in the upper echelons of the distribution, the socioeconomic distribution. Now the best way to see just how concentrated the wealth becomes under such a scenario that we have today is by looking at the distribution of UK property wealth by percentile, not decile, which still gives you a pretty skewed distribution, but if you look at it by percentile, so along the bottom axis you can see all the way up to 100, you can see the distribution of property wealth and the top 1%, and these are estimates because it's actually very hard to find out truly how much the very wealthy own, because a lot of it is hidden off the balance sheets, but there are ways of estimating it that are reasonably accurate. This is from the Office of National Statistics, and you can see how skewed that distribution is. So this system is a system that every year is increasing wealth inequality very significantly. Now, that's all a bit doom and gloom. How can we get out of this mess? And I haven't got very long left to talk about this, but hopefully in the Q&A we can have a lively debate, because I don't think the answers are necessarily clear-cut, especially when you try to factor in not just pure economic logic, but the actual political economy that we are facing. And I'll focus my reform comments on three areas. Firstly, ownership, particularly the ownership of land, and this is obviously a controversial one. All of us lucky enough to own property here in central London, I'll be quite resistant to some of the comments that I'll be making on ownership. The second area will be tax, and the third area I'll talk more about the financial system itself. On ownership, well, if you remove land from the market, and if you collectivise land, then of course many of the problems of economic rent that I've been talking about are in one fell swoop significantly ameliorated. Now, that may sound like, very scary, communist nationalisation of land, but actually it's very interesting to note, and Andrew's done some very good research on this, that some countries, some of the most economically successful economies in the world, the state is the majority landowner. So one of those countries is Singapore, where 90% of land is owned by the state, and they make long leases to the private sector to develop goods and services, and Andrew, I'm sure, can talk more about that because he's written a book on it, and this is quoting from his book. In 2012, government receipts from land sales totaled 9.1 billion. And Singapore is very interesting because, of course, it's known as a free market, super free market, hyper free market economy, with very low taxes on big multinationals and sort of centre of finance. And of course, there's lots of stories that the real Brexit plan for this UK government is to turn us into the European Singapore, and that's how we'll keep the banks in London. Well, Singapore, if we really turned ourselves into Singapore, we'd be nationalising 90% of the land, and we'd get plenty of rents from those banks located in central London. So it's quite an interesting one. Another example is South Korea. The Korean Land Corporation, set up in 1975, controls 50% residential and all commercial development. And it just purchases land, it develops it in a way it thinks is most needed for the population, and then it sells it on, making a healthy profit. It's jointly owned by the Korean government and the Korean Development Bank. The government owns 73% of it, the bank owns 26%. And the shareholders pay in capital for shareholder status. In 2007, the Korean Land Corporation was responsible for around half of all residential development and almost all industrial land development in the country. Usually this development was in new towns, major housing developments and industrial estates. As part of its function, the KLC developed and sold land for residential use, acquired idle and vacant land for resale, issued land debentures, reclaimed land and developed new towns. This is an extremely powerful economic body that's been created by the state that, to some extent at least, has made Korea one of the few advanced economies where, in fact, land values and house prices have not been increasing at a faster rate than incomes. You can see that very clearly on this chart, which shows compares the Great Britain house price to income ratio, the red, with the Korean house price to income ratio, and the green. And you can see the Korean ratio falling as more and more of land was controlled by the state in the late 90s period. In contrast, in the UK, we've had this incredible volatility with the boom and bust of the late 80s, early 90s, and leading up to the financial crisis. So that's one area I'd really like to do more research on. How have Korea managed and Singapore managed to do this? What can we learn? How might we be able to replicate their achievements? Of course, in the UK, we have community land trusts and other forms of community-led housing, which are attempting to kind of take back control of land and maintain the affordability of housing by separating the land value from the cost of property. And these are areas that NEF is doing a lot of work to try and support. And this is one of those areas where it's possible you might get agreement from both Conservatives and Labour on some of these issues. So it's an interesting one. Okay, I'm going to talk, and finally, would it be possible, I suppose, to try and combine aspects of the Singapore approach with the community land trust and have some sort of national mutual land trust into which you could trade when you wanted to, when you had enough of this huge mortgage weighing down your life, you could, sell that land part of your house into a national trust and keep hold of the property. So it would be a way of collectivising land value and economic rents while still enabling people to have that security of owning a home. That's one idea that we're doing research on and we'd love to explore further. What about tax? So physically taking property away from people, very difficult. Likely to be, Daily Mail, nasty headlines. I won't talk too much about that. But, would an easier way of doing this just to be to implement more appropriate tax on the value of land, the land value tax concept? Well, this is one of those very rare areas where there's almost universal agreement amongst economists that it's a very good idea. So you can get economists from the far right and the far left in agreement that economically this is the most sensible tax. The OECD, the IMF, virtually all of the big economic bodies have come out in recent times saying land value tax in a world where we are running with increasing public debt is the most sensible way forward, because it should not restrain the production of goods and services. If you tax land, it simply won't affect production, but it could bring in more land into productive use. Is an eminently sensible tax. What are the barriers? Well, one of the barriers in this country is a practical one. There is no published data on land, and this is an area that's very scary. But then perhaps the biggest barriers are political. Now, one of the obvious ones is simply vested interests. Most MPs in Parliament own properties in London or in other nice parts of the country, and they'd have a huge amount to lose from having their taxes significantly increased with a land value tax. But there's also a sort of more general political problem in that the way these land value taxes have been introduced has generally been very visible. It's generally an annual payment, sort of council tax, but much bigger. And people just don't like that kind of tax. They don't like having a cheque coming through the door saying you must pay £2,000 because you've been living in this part of the country over the last year. And so one of the solutions might be to see if we could introduce this tax as a reduction from income in the way that national insurance and income taxes is implemented. In Ireland, they introduced a property tax quite successfully using this kind of technique. So that could be one way around the problem. An easier step than introducing a completely new tax would be just simply to revalue council tax, and then perhaps to have a split rate tax system where you would identify the value of the land increasing and the property, and over time reduce the property tax and increase the land tax. You could perhaps introduce it in a stealthy way like that. The key thing, I think, would be to make it tax neutral, to reduce income tax and even reduce corporation tax, dare I say it, whilst at the same time increasing land value tax, and that's how you need to try and sell it into the system. Right, I've talked for too long now, but I'll just briefly finish on financial reform, because this is key. I mean, if we introduce a land value tax or we nationalise land very rapidly, the banking sector will find itself in with a very serious problem, because so much of banks' assets are collateralised against land, and it's very easy to see why banks collateralise their loans against land, because land is permanent, immovable, immobile, appreciates in value rather than depreciates in value, and if we massively reduce its value by introducing a tax or nationalising it, the banks will be in very serious trouble. So we have to bring in financial reforms at the same time that we try and erode some of those economic rents. And at NEF we've been talking about a number of ways you might do this. You could introduce credit guidance. The Bank of England could expand its macro-prudential policies to not only suppress credit flowing to property, but encourage banks to lend against businesses and firms. Currently, banks have to hold only half the capital if they want to make a loan against a property as they do against a small business. Why don't we just reverse that? Why, banks should have to hold less capital if they're lending to small businesses than than against property. It's a micro versus macro problem, essentially. The way in which banks could overcome the risk associated with lending types of institution to be making loans against property, to be making mortgage loans, because mortgage loans are inherently long-term. They last 20 years, 30 years. But banks are organisations with very short-term liabilities. Their liabilities are our deposits that we can withdraw on demand, or their liabilities are loans to other banks in an interbank market, which are even more flighty, perhaps, than deposits. Surely, the types of institutions that should be lending against property for long-term loans should be institutions with long-term liabilities, pension funds, institutional investors, and equity type mortgages where the risk is shared by the lender and the borrower. Islamic finance mortgage debt, well, not debt but equity, is worth exploring in greater depth. And I think that is a very interesting area to explore. More broadly, I'm quite supportive of the idea that of narrow banking or sovereign money reforms that would, I think, reduce financial instability. And as long as there was still plenty of elasticity for credit flowing to these SMEs, we could have a much safer and more productive financial system. I've ran well over time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.